Out of all of the movies and shows in the entire Zorro franchise, the 2024 miniseries, created by Jean Dujardin on Paramount Plus, only recently released in the United States and inconveniently known as just Zorro, is one of the most complicated of his stories for me to talk about, as well as for the entire Zorro fandom. People either adore the show for its satirical wit and clever writing, and others despise it for seemingly taking a sledgehammer to the character and the legend of Zorro. But for me, it's hard for me to quantify how I feel about it, and I'll get more into that later. But for now, I feel torn on it. It's both brilliant, overly mean-spirited, meaningful, incomprehensible, and audaciously French, all at the same time, and it is definitely not for everyone. However, I think there's a lot of merit in the bones of this controversial take on the character, and I am more than happy to delve into this weird little show and listen as it asks the question to its theme song. Who is Zorro?
J'ai appris à mes dépens que le vice est divorce des vertus. Diego était juste, mais lâche. Zorro courageux mais faux. Promets-moi d'assumer qui tu es. Tout entier.
Mon fils.
Vive la Révolution!
Le terrible Zorro.
I realize writing this that a lot of people haven't seen or even heard of the new show, especially due to only being streamed in the US since June. So, let me go over the basics. Jean Dujardin's Zorro miniseries is, similarly to stories like Zorro the Gay Blade, a parody of the character and his stories. However, unlike Gay Blade, which was a lighthearted spoof, this series is a biting satire of Zorro, the people he protects, the franchise itself, and the politics of it all. It has an incredibly intense, oftentimes mean-spirited sense of humor that feels out of place for longtime Zorro fans, and oftentimes feels incredibly, immensely uncomfortable, especially if you are attached to the characters it is satirizing. For many, I believe the show upsets them deeply because for many people, myself included when I was younger, Zorro is often meant to be an escapist fantasy, where a compassionate hero swoops down to battle the injustices and inequalities of the world. The show, on the other hand, gives that mythos of the character a good, long look and picks it apart in some of the most uncomfortable, brutal ways possible. Characters we've been able to grow attached to for decades are given severe character flaws that can make your skin crawl if you're attached to them. It is a story that challenges and critiques the idea of Zorro himself as what he stands for and protects. I'll get into it more in later parts, but it is a story that paints a complicated, frustrating, and even sometimes ugly picture of the world of Zorro and the people he protects, where it often feels like there's very little, if not anything, to fight for. It can often be pessimistic and cruel on its outset, which in a franchise as positive and hopeful as Zorro can feel incredibly off-putting. However, I have shown this series to a few other friends and Zorro fans who have shown me another argument in favor of this story, of it being a story that venerates what Zorro truly means, and paints a complicated but sympathetic view of these characters, humanizing them beyond the century-spanning mythology that has become so entrenched with the character. A mythology that at times can be rigid and unmoving with the times. The show, outside its themes, also has a lot to offer in general. The fight choreography is so much fun. The acting is superb, the set design and cinematography, while not as stylish as Sequoia Studios' Zorro, still feels incredibly good to look at. And the show is just also really funny.
Lis, à haute voix.
18 mètres de...
Maître de soie noire, oui, et
à destination...
à destination de l'hacienda de Don Diego de la Vega.
However, we will be covering the storytelling of the show exclusively this time, unlike the Sequoia Studios Zorro, as the contents of it have been heavily debated upon, and I would like to offer my 2 cents. To begin this slightly unfocused video, let's start with Senior Zorro himself, and why Jean Dujardin's version of the character is so different. Jean Dujardin's version of Diego de la Vega, while heroic and compassionate like his predecessors, is also a deeply complicated, even somewhat selfish man, suffocated under the weight of all his masks. Like so many versions of the man, Jean Dujardin's Don Diego saw California gripped by injustice and cruelty, and the people subjugated, and decided to do something. Garbed in black, and aided by his trusty manservant Bernardo, Diego rode into the night as the legendary Zorro. However, unlike most stories, the miniseries is not about a young Diego righting wrongs and getting the girl. This is a story about an old man with many regrets, trapped within a prison of his own making 20 years after his adventures first ended. Right away, it's incredibly obvious to the viewer that Diego is in some way stagnated. While his swordsmanship and his love for the people remain, he seems like a deeply aimless, awkward version of his own self. He starts the first episode before the word Zorro is even so much as spoken, getting beaten up by robbers after they trick him into believing in a slogan, embarrassing himself in front of his father and an entire crowd, being manipulated and bullied by Don Emanuel, and being incapable of showing his wife Gabriela any sort of genuine intimacy.
Panis.
Oh yeah, and Don Alejandro, who's the current alcalde of Los Angeles, dies. And now Diego has to govern in his stead and does a
Penis.
subpar job. This version of Alejandro was controversial among fans, to say the least, especially for me. The show is heavily inspired by Walt Disney's Zorro, and that version of the character has a Don Alejandro who is a deeply beloved character by fans and is considered one of the best incarnations of the character ever. So when this show makes a version heavily visually inspired by said character, who is not a good person and is also a terrible father, it hurts a lot. However, I feel like it also adds a decent bit of internal conflict to Diego, as in episode 1 he helps establish Diego as someone incapable of defending himself and as someone who is missing any ounce of courage he used to have. However, it is after his passing where he becomes even more interesting. Like the Sequoia Studios Zorro, this show also has Alejandro be a ghost in the narrative. Although unlike the former, this show's ghost is a lot more literal. Alejandro comes back from the dead, in a way, when Diego is utterly powerless against Don Emanuel, who torches a Native American village and has his soldiers kidnap a child. When Diego is unable or more unwilling to do anything to help, Alejandro comes back to not only haunt Diego, but to open a part of him he had kept buried for a long, long time.
Los Angeles a besoin d'un défenseur à sa mesure et j'ai bien peur que tu ne sois pas cette personne.
For a long time, the Zorro franchise has toyed around with the idea of Diego de la Vega and Zorro not just being roles the one man plays, but the two pieces of his personality, with the most notable example of this before the show being the New World Zorro show from the Family Channel in the early 90s. However, most Zorro examples of Diego's duality of him splitting himself into different people is usually left for subtext. But for this show, it is the explicit point. Diego did not just become more passive with age, he shut off a part of himself that drove him to fight injustice in the first place. The Diego de la Vega we've been watching this episode is not a whole person, but merely half a man, who has denied the world a more confident, boisterous, and thrill-seeking side to himself. For a long time, he thought he didn't need to keep that side of himself, and for a time, he has been able to shove the side of him deep inside his mind, the side of him whose blood boils at the sight of oppression and cruelty, who laughs in the face of tyrants instead of meekly rolling over for them. But those times have ended, and that side of him can no longer be contained. Zorro has returned, and he, not Diego the Alcalde, will make things right. The rescue plan for the poor, imprisoned child goes well at first. Diego manages to sneak into the prison somewhat, and goes through a lot of the Zorro tropes everyone's familiar with. He bullies the sergeant, we'll talk more about later, rescues Nakai, the child kidnapped by the soldiers, kicks some ass, escapes the army's garrison with ease, and gets cheated on by himself. Diego won against the Spanish army and Don Emmanuel for now. The victory feels so small in the moment when he can only watch the person he cherished the most betray his trust right in front of him. And the worst part of it is that it is all his own fault. This isn't the story about a man fighting for justice. It's a story about a man fighting himself.